December 26, 1944. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald was locked in a dogfight over the Philippine jungle when every gun on his P-38 Lightning went silent. 4 50 caliber machine guns, dead. His 20mm cannon jammed solid. The Mitsubishi Zero ahead of him turned hard, the Japanese pilot realizing MacDonald's guns weren't firing anymore and seeing an opportunity to turn hunter into hunted. MacDonald had 2 165-gallon drop tanks hanging under his wings, each one still carrying about 80 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, and in the next 30 seconds he was going to do something his commanding officers had explicitly forbidden as criminally reckless suicide. MacDonald wasn't some rookie making desperate choices in his first combat mission. He was leading the 475th Fighter Group, the unit nicknamed Satan's Angels, and he'd been fighting Japanese aircraft over the Pacific for months, racking up kills and earning respect from every pilot in his squadron. But 3 weeks earlier, when he'd proposed a radical new tactic during a briefing session, his superiors had shut him down immediately and made sure everyone in the room knew exactly how they felt about it. The idea was simple but insane. If your guns jammed and you still had your external drop tanks attached, you could use them as weapons by ramming enemy aircraft before jettisoning the tanks and escaping. The group commanders called it Hollywood nonsense, the kind of cowboy thinking that got pilots killed and made widows back home. Drop tanks are fuel containers, they said, not weapons. You'll lose control of your aircraft, get shot down, or blow yourself up trying this stunt. Fellow pilots mocked the idea as desperation from someone who'd watched too many propaganda films where everything worked out perfectly and heroes never died. If stories like this show you just how insane World War II aerial combat really was, hit that subscribe button because we're diving into the most unbelievable moments of the Pacific War every single week. And trust me, what happens next is going to blow your mind. But now, at 300 miles per hour over Luzon with a Zero pilot lining up to shred his aircraft, MacDonald didn't have the luxury of following regulations or worrying about what his commanding officers would say when he landed. The Zero was turning inside his position, and MacDonald could see the muzzle flashes starting as the Japanese pilot opened fire, tracers beginning to arc through the air toward his cockpit. He had maybe 5 seconds before those rounds started tearing through his cockpit and turning him into a casualty statistic. His wingmen were engaged with other enemy fighters and couldn't help, locked in their own desperate struggles to stay alive as the dogfight swirled across the sky. Radio chatter filled his headset with the chaos of the battle happening all around him, pilots calling out positions and warnings as the sky filled with tracers and smoke and the distant thunder of explosions. MacDonald's hands moved on the controls, his P-38 responding instantly as he pushed the throttles forward and aimed his aircraft directly at the Zero like a battering ram with wings. The P-38 Lightning was a strange-looking aircraft, twin-boomed with its cockpit mounted in the center nacelle between 2 powerful Allison engines that could push the plane to over 400 miles per hour in level flight. Those drop tanks weren't just lightweight aluminum shells either. Each 165-gallon tank weighed over 300 pounds when partially full, and at the closure speed MacDonald was building, they were about to become kinetic weapons delivering the same impact force as artillery shells. The Japanese pilot saw MacDonald diving toward him and probably thought the American had lost his mind, because nobody rams another aircraft on purpose unless they're planning to die in the process, unless they've given up and decided to take their enemy with them in one final act of desperation. But MacDonald had calculated something his superiors hadn't considered when they banned the tactic. The drop tanks were mounted on pylons designed for quick release, and if he hit the enemy aircraft at just the right angle with just the right timing, he might survive what came next. The mission had started like dozens of others MacDonald had flown over the Philippines. Fighters sweep over Luzon, hunting for Japanese aircraft and protecting American bombers hitting targets across the island. Intelligence had reported increased Japanese fighter activity in the area, and MacDonald's squadron had launched that morning expecting to find enemy aircraft. They'd found them all right, more than expected, and the sky had turned into a whirling chaos of fighters as American P-38s tangled with Japanese Zeros and Oscars in a dogfight that spread across miles of airspace. MacDonald had been chasing this particular Zero for almost 2 minutes, maneuvering for position, trying to get a clean shot as both aircraft twisted and turned through the sky. Then his guns had jammed, all of them, simultaneously, and suddenly he was flying an unarmed fighter in the middle of a combat zone with an enemy pilot who was about to realize MacDonald couldn't shoot back. The distance closed faster than thought. MacDonald lined up his left wing, the drop tank hanging beneath it positioned like a lance as he bore down on the Zero's tail section. At 300 miles per hour combined closure speed, he had fractions of a second to adjust his aim, to make tiny corrections with the stick that would mean the difference between success and death. Too high and he'd miss completely, waste his only chance and give the Zero pilot time to kill him. Too low and he'd collide with the Zero's fuselage and kill them both in a fireball that would leave nothing but burning wreckage scattered across the jungle below. The Zero pilot was still firing, still turning, still confident he had the advantage because MacDonald's guns were silent and the American appeared to be making a suicidal head-on run. Then the 165-gallon aluminum drop tank, still carrying 80 gallons of high-octane fuel, slammed into the Zero's tail and right wing root with the force of a bomb. The impact was catastrophic and instant. The aluminum tank crumpled on contact, but not before transferring all its kinetic energy into the Zero's lightweight airframe in a violent exchange of momentum that physics demanded. The fuel inside ignited immediately, turning the collision into a fireball that engulfed the Zero's entire tail section in flames that burned white-hot and spread faster than the eye could follow. Metal twisted and tore as the structural supports holding the Zero's empennage shattered under the impact, rivets popping and aluminum skin peeling away like paper. The enemy fighter's tail simply disintegrated, ripped away from the fuselage by the combination of kinetic force and explosive fire that destroyed the aircraft's structural integrity in less than a second. Without its tail, the Zero had no directional control and no way to maintain stable flight. The aircraft rolled hard right, then pitched nose down into an uncontrollable spin that sent it tumbling toward the jungle canopy 15,000 feet below, trailing smoke and flames as it fell. MacDonald's P-38 shuddered violently from the impact, the entire airframe shaking as if it had hit a brick wall at full speed, every rivet and weld stressed beyond what the designers had planned for. His left wing showed visible stress damage. The metal skin wrinkled near the pylon where the drop tank had been mounted before the collision tore it free. Fuel from his own tank had sprayed backward across his canopy during the impact, coating the plexiglass with a film that made it hard to see forward and turned the sunlight into a blurred haze. Warning lights flickered on his instrument panel as the aircraft's stressed components registered damage, red indicators telling him systems were compromised. For a terrifying moment, MacDonald thought his wing might fold completely, that the stress fractures he could see spreading across the metal would tear the entire wing off and send him spinning to his death just like the Zero pilot. But the P-38's robust construction held together, the redundant structural supports doing exactly what they were designed to do. He was alive, his aircraft was still flying, and below him the Zero was falling in pieces toward the earth. MacDonald's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat as he pulled back on the stick and gained altitude, putting distance between himself and the dogfight that was still raging below. His hands were shaking on the controls, adrenaline flooding his system as his brain caught up with what had just happened. He'd just destroyed an enemy aircraft by ramming it with a drop tank, survived the impact, and was still flying. The tactic everyone said was suicide had worked. He was alive. The Zero was dead. And now he had to get his damaged aircraft back to base and explain what he'd done. When MacDonald landed back at base and climbed out of his damaged P-38, his hands were still shaking from adrenaline and his flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the relatively cool air. He walked straight to the operations tent to report the engagement, and that's when things got complicated. His commanding officer listened to the story, looked at MacDonald like he'd grown a second head, and then flatly refused to credit the kill. It was impossible, the CO said. You couldn't destroy an enemy aircraft by ramming it with a drop tank and survive. The story had to be fabricated or exaggerated, some kind of confusion in the heat of combat when everything happens too fast to process clearly. MacDonald tried to explain exactly what happened, step by step, walking through the maneuver and the impact and the result, but the CO wasn't buying it. The tactic had been banned for good reason, and now MacDonald was claiming he'd successfully done the one thing everyone said would get you killed. But MacDonald's wingmen had seen the whole thing. They'd been fighting their own engagements when they saw MacDonald's P-38 dive at the Zero, saw the collision, saw the fireball, and saw the enemy aircraft disintegrate midair while MacDonald pulled away with his damaged but still flying Lightning. Their testimony corroborated every detail of MacDonald's report, and they were willing to swear to it under oath. Even better, MacDonald's gun camera footage, while not capturing the actual moment of impact because of the angle and speed involved, clearly showed his guns weren't firing and showed the Zero suddenly exploding without any visible bullet strikes or external cause. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. MacDonald had destroyed an enemy aircraft using a tactic that wasn't supposed to work, and he'd survived to tell about it. The kill was eventually credited after 3 days of investigation and review. The intelligence officers examined the gun camera footage frame by frame, interviewed MacDonald's wingmen separately to check for inconsistencies in their stories, and finally concluded that yes, this insane tactic had actually worked exactly as MacDonald described. But crediting the kill and officially endorsing the tactic were two very different things. The group commanders weren't about to put their names on a document that told pilots to ram enemy aircraft with their drop tanks. That was still suicide as far as official policy was concerned, still reckless and dangerous and not something anyone wanted to encourage. Yet something interesting happened in the weeks after MacDonald's successful engagement. The ban on drop tank ramming was quietly lifted from official combat procedures, not because anyone was willing to endorse it, but because nobody wanted to court-martial a pilot for using it if they found themselves in the same desperate situation MacDonald had faced. Pilots started talking about the tactic in ready rooms and briefings, not as an encouraged maneuver but as a last resort option when everything else failed. If your guns jammed, if you were out of ammunition, if you had no other choice and death was certain otherwise, those drop tanks weren't just fuel containers anymore. They were 300-pound weapons traveling at hundreds of miles per hour, and if you had the skill and the nerve, you might be able to use them to save your life. A few other pilots attempted the maneuver in the final months of the war, with mixed results. Some succeeded and survived, proving MacDonald's success wasn't just luck. Others died trying, their timing off by fractions of a second or their aim not quite perfect enough. But the option existed now, documented and proven, and that made all the difference when pilots found themselves in impossible situations. MacDonald kept flying combat missions through the end of the war, and his skill as a fighter pilot became legendary throughout the 475th Fighter Group. He eventually racked up 27 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the top American aces of the Pacific Theater. But that Zero he destroyed on December 26, 1944, the one he killed without firing a single bullet, remained the most unusual victory of his entire combat career. Other pilots had shot down more enemy aircraft. Other aces had higher kill counts and more decorated service records. But MacDonald had proven something nobody else could claim. He'd turned a forbidden tactic into a legitimate combat technique, and he'd survived the one thing everyone said was impossible. The Japanese Zero he destroyed that day was a formidable opponent in its own right, one of the most maneuverable fighters in the Pacific War. Early in the conflict, Zeros had dominated the skies over China and the Pacific Islands, their lightweight construction and powerful engines making them nearly impossible to outmaneuver in a turning fight. American pilots had learned the hard way not to try matching a Zero turn for turn, because the Japanese fighter could almost always outturn anything the Americans flew in the early years of the war. But the Zero's advantages came with critical weaknesses that became more apparent as the war progressed. That lightweight construction meant minimal armor protection for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks, so any hit that penetrated could be fatal. A few good hits from American .50 caliber machine guns could turn a zero into a fireball. And when MacDonald slammed 300 pounds of aluminum and fuel into one at 300 miles per hour, those structural weaknesses became fatal in an instant. The P-38 Lightning MacDonald flew that day was built like a tank compared to the Zero, with redundant systems and structural strength that could absorb punishment and keep flying even when damaged. That robust construction saved MacDonald's life when the impact should have torn his aircraft apart. The wings held together despite the stress. The engines kept running despite the vibration. The control surfaces kept responding despite the damage. American engineering had built an aircraft that could survive punishment no Japanese fighter could endure, and that engineering made the difference between MacDonald landing safely and MacDonald dying in a fireball over the Philippine jungle. The tactic that had started as a banned proposal in a briefing room became part of the informal knowledge passed between fighter pilots in the final year of the war. Nobody wrote official training manuals about ramming enemy aircraft with drop tanks. No instructor ever stood in front of a class and demonstrated the proper technique on a blackboard. But pilots talked, stories spread, and MacDonald's successful engagement became the proof that sometimes the rulebook didn't have all the answers. Sometimes survival meant doing the thing everyone said was impossible, the thing that looked like suicide on paper but worked when executed by a skilled pilot who had no other choice. December 26, 1944, over the jungles of Luzon, MacDonald had proven that in aerial combat, everything on your aircraft becomes a weapon if you're desperate enough and skilled enough to use it. The drop tanks that were supposed to be nothing more than fuel containers had just destroyed an enemy fighter without a single bullet fired. The tactic his commanders called criminally reckless had saved his life and killed his enemy. The maneuver that was officially banned became quietly accepted as a last resort option when death was the only alternative. MacDonald survived the war and eventually retired from military service. But his legacy lived on in the stories pilots told about the day someone destroyed a Zero by hitting it with a drop tank and lived to report the kill. The gun camera footage became part of training materials, not as an example of recommended tactics, but as proof that combat situations sometimes demanded improvisation beyond what any manual could predict. The 475th Fighter Group Satan's Angels continued flying missions until Japan surrendered, and every pilot in that unit knew the story of their commander who'd done the impossible and made it look easy. By the time the war ended, American fighter pilots had proven their superiority over the Pacific skies through technological advantage, numerical superiority, and aggressive tactics that pushed the limits of what their aircraft could do. The P-38 Lightning, the aircraft MacDonald flew, eventually recorded over 1,800 Japanese aircraft destroyed, and the 475th Fighter Group alone accounted for 552 confirmed aerial victories. But among all those kills, all those dogfights, all those successful engagements, MacDonald's drop tank ram remained unique. 0 bullets fired. 1 enemy aircraft destroyed. 1 pilot who refused to accept death when his guns failed and found another way to win. The commanders who banned the tactic had been trying to protect their pilots from reckless decisions, and they weren't wrong to worry. The maneuver was dangerous, borderline suicidal, and required split-second timing that most pilots couldn't execute under combat stress. But MacDonald had proven it could be done, and in doing so, he'd given every American fighter pilot in the Pacific one more option when facing impossible odds. Thanks for watching this story from the WW2 Vault. Next week we're covering the moment AB-17 crew flew their burning bomber home with half the tail section blown off and no hydraulics. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and remember, these aren't just history lessons. These are the real stories of real people who did impossible things when everything was on the line.